Since it is Mother's Day, I thought it would be appropriate to direct a message more so towards honoring the women in our lives. And before we get into the Bible, though, you really can't escape the fact that society for some time has been trying very hard to alter and change the roles of men and women. There are attempts out there to make women feel inferior if they prefer some of the more traditional roles, for instance, staying home with the kids, maybe working a part-time job on the side if they want to for a little extra cash, and just allowing dad to be the breadwinner and to be the full-time worker and so forth. Some people want women to feel like they are less of a woman if they don't desire a fancy career and things like that. But despite the pressure to change these typical traditional roles, there is actually evidence out there that many among the younger generation are not on board with these changes. The New York Times published an article just a year ago, and they looked at the age range of 18 to 34, and they asked them a bunch of questions about these roles and what they prefer and so forth. And most of them prefer that the man of the family works full-time, and that mom either works part-time, as I said, or just if she's able to, stays home with the kids. Also, a majority of this young age range think that a man should not be a stay-at-home dad if mom is out there working full-time. Personally, I was very surprised at these findings when you consider that this younger generation is much more accepting of certain things like same-sex marriage and transgenderism and stuff like that that's all in the news recently. Despite that, they still stick to some fairly traditional roles. And this tells me there is still a significant portion of that younger society that isn't completely ready to just scrap the traditional fabric of society and move on with something new. And to me, that's encouraging. Regardless, there are still some out there who strive to tear down these traditional societal roles, and they also point at the church as being outdated and backwards in regards to their treatment of women and this kind of things. But the dirty little secret that they say that you never hear anyone mention is that the church was actually the trailblazer in giving women rights that they did not have among pagan societies. The difficulty is people will read the Bible and they'll find a small passage here or another one over there that seems to restrict women to certain roles and restrict ministry functions in the church to just men. For instance, just teaching or just preaching is only a man's job. That's what they think, but we'll get into that much more shortly. The fact is that there were many cultural issues that were influencing the Apostle Paul when he was writing his letters, and specifically in his first letter to the Corinthians and his first letter to Timothy, by the way. And so he's not writing these words in a vacuum. So the short passage that we are going to look at this morning, I think, is conveniently passed over by many people in my position. Preachers just don't want to touch it. We let it go and hope people ignore it and those kind of things because it seems very controversial. But I really wonder how many people truly take the time to learn the truth and learn what's behind it and what that really means. We will see shortly that there seems to be a blanket restriction against women in ministry, but that we'll also see how that is quite the opposite of what it actually seems. So we'll read it first, and as I read it, I do encourage you to keep an open mind, first of all. The passage is found in 1 Timothy chapter 2, And again, I'm just pulling out a part because I want to focus in on, the heart of the matter here. If you're following in your Pew Bible, it's on page 839. And we'll just read from verse 8 through the end of the chapter, which is verse 15. So the words of the Apostle Paul is, I want men everywhere to lift up holy hands in prayer, without anger or disputing. I also want women to dress modestly, with decency and propriety, not with braided hair or gold or pearls or expensive clothes, but with good deeds, appropriate for women who profess to worship God. A woman should learn in quietness and full submission. I do not permit a woman to teach or to have authority over a man. She must be silent. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. And Adam was not the one deceived, it was the woman who was deceived and became a sinner. But women will be saved through childbearing if they continue in faith, love, and holiness with propriety. May the Lord's blessing be added to the reading and hearing of his word, and may the Lord open our minds to understand his word as was intended. It's passages like this that make me appreciate having a sturdy wooden pulpit up here, because not only does it hold my notes, but it also provides a barrier that I can duck against to dodge flying objects. But seriously, after reading that, I can see why people read the Bible and they come away with the ideas that church has these antiquated views of women and those kind of things. And without the proper context, like anything, it sounds pretty bad. But sadly, where we are right now in the 21st century, with all of the knowledge at our fingertips, with computers and phones and that kind of thing, with all of that information, people still get it wrong, and they just don't search after the truth as I think many people should. There are even still certain church denominations that read this passage just as is, and they say, okay, we will not allow a woman to preach, or we won't allow a woman to lead a Bible study. And I find it sad. It's unfortunate for a variety of reasons. But first things first, before we get into all that, people tend, when you read this, you focus on the prohibitions against women can't do this, women can't do that. But Paul first starts there with challenging men, by the way. And again, many of the men, what you don't read was many of them didn't want to participate in the worship. Some modern churches have traditions where, for instance, when you take the offering, you have the couple ushers come up and they pass the plate and then they come to the front. Sometimes one of them will be called on to give the blessing on it. Okay? Now, we, of course, don't do that here. We could if we wanted to. But it would be like if we did that here, and if I asked one of the ushers, okay, can you pray over the offering? And if one of the guys, he rolls his eyes and he grumbles and mutters under his breath and he just says something just to get it done. Paul is saying everybody in the church has a duty to participate. Otherwise, why are you there? In our day, I'm sure there are people who more or less they occupy the role of a consumer in worship. And not to pick on the large mega churches, but it's easy whenever you have 1,000 or 2,000 people there to get lost in the crowd. I'll go Sunday morning, I'll put in my hour or two, I'll get an inspirational word, and I'll go home, and nobody's going to require anything of me. It can happen, and Paul said that's not the way we ought to be perceiving and approaching church. So Paul isn't only picking on the women here. He had some strong words for men too, and he wants men to be the men that God called them to be. Then he does go and he addresses the women, and first of all he says, okay, be mindful of your clothing and the way that you're dressing and so forth, because he knew in certain churches in the time, this was a problem. Some of the women were using their clothes and the way they were doing up their hair in big braids and all, very showy, to draw attention to themselves. And as the church was growing, there were more and more people coming into the church who they didn't have a Jewish background. They didn't know what was expected in a church service or not. So you bring all these secular attitudes into the church, and Paul sees this happening, and he says, some of these things aren't good. And he says, we need to conform to Christ, not conform the church to the secular culture. Outside of the church, they knew that if they dressed a certain way, or if they wore a certain hairstyle, or wore their expensive clothes, they could assert their status in society. They could show off their newest wardrobe that they purchased at Saks Fifth Avenue, knowing that there's many others there who are shopping at Walmart or even a Goodwill to just get, whatever they needed. So he said, don't walk into church trying to act all prestigious. That way you think you'll get the best seating, and maybe someone will put you in a leadership position because, you're up on here and I'm above the other person who's down there. Instead, Paul encourages the women to put more effort into doing good deeds, do good things, to further the church rather than impress other people with what you're wearing and how your hair looks and all these kind of things. Then we get into the good stuff this morning, really around verse 11. This is the verse that starts to elicit more of the dirty looks, by the way. And people you look at it through 21st century lenses, and you wonder, where in the world does Paul get off telling these women to learn in silence? And, does this mean women can't ever talk in church at all? Well, there's a lot more behind the words than meets the eye. Some people, again, along with the clothes and the hairstyles, they were treating church more or less like a country club rather than a house of God like it should be. And outside the church, there were certain ones who they knew the latest gossip. They knew what was going on with everyone in the small town. And Paul is saying women need to learn in church quietly because with all the talking and gossiping they're doing, it's probably hard for them to listen to God and gossip at the same time, basically. So if gossiping and talking about other people wasn't such an issue, he's just making a point about that. And I think if Paul were here today, he'd say, if this is what you're used to doing, talking about everybody behind their back and so forth, maybe it's best you just keep quiet for the whole church service, and maybe you'll learn something about God and change your ways and treat people a little better. This was his way to basically reel in the busybodies too. Former First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt had a wonderful quote. She said, "Great minds discuss ideas, average minds discuss events, and small minds discuss people." I think that the women that Paul had in mind way back in the first century could have learned a lesson from the wisdom of Ms. Roosevelt. So Paul isn't saying women can never speak in church at all, but the concept behind it does still apply to believers in every era, for men and for women. If you can't mind your business and honor God at the same time, well, guess what? Maybe it's best you just keep quiet and allow God to speak to you, and that way you can hear him talk. It just so happens that, a little unfortunate for women, that women were guilty of this more so than the men back in the first century. But I'm sure that Paul would have the same words for the men if the roles were reversed. And you can read in Paul's letters, he has a lot of problems with the men too, that he takes plenty of time to address. It's clear from the underlying issues going on that Paul's prohibition, and there was a prohibition, they weren't allowed for a certain time, but that's it. It was only for a certain time, a certain place, and a certain situation. I think of it like back when I was, I think about 16 years old, I had my wisdom teeth removed. And after the days after I was put on a strict diet, I couldn't eat anything hard like chips and pretzels naturally. You just cut up the stitches and all that. I had to eat solid or soft foods like Jell-O and yogurt and ice cream. Looking back, it wasn't really that bad of a deal for a few days anyway. But if somebody would see this paper that they gave me and it was written, and if you had no context, you would go away thinking, this is a terrible doctor. I'm not allowing him to eat a balanced diet. Well, again, you lose the context that it's only for a certain number of days. And the doctor would not necessarily have to say, just the days following your surgery, do this. It's understood. And so the same thing goes for Paul. There are certain things he doesn't have to repeat and write down the obvious context behind it, because he knew that his readers would know what he's talking about. The problem for us, we're looking at it 2,000 years later, and we don't have that same obvious context. So we have to do a little digging, do a little research, and find out why this seems the way that it is. So Paul goes from talking about silence, and he starts connecting that to the issue of teaching as well, where he says, I do not permit a woman to teach and so forth and remain silent and all that. Well, same thing. Women were only restricted from the teaching function in the church because they needed to learn more. Like I said, many of them were brand new to the church. And they might actually learn something if they would keep quiet, stop talking about other people, and basically, stay out of everybody else's business. Now, me, a man, have actually been in their shoes before, and I'll explain what I mean. Whenever I first felt the call to ministry, I talked to Pastor Marty about it, said, what am I going to have to do? Let me find out if this is really for me and so forth. And he did not say, let me put you in the pulpit this coming Sunday and we'll find out what you can do. It doesn't work like that. I didn't know the first thing about preaching. I didn't know near enough about the Bible, for one thing. So our church denomination and all denominations set forth certain criteria for a person to meet before they're going to allow them to preach God's word. You have to display a certain aptitude, complete certain credits in a seminary or a Bible school, and all that. And then they have a process to get licensing, and then you get ordination, and all those kind of things. Paul's just saying most of the women in the church he had in view, they just weren't prepared for teaching. They were probably very new to the faith and so forth. And when you read everything that is in there, he says nothing about the possibility of opening that door to them in the future once they show a certain aptitude and so forth. The more we get into this, I can see how we are at such a disadvantage here in the 21st century, because the average 21st century American Christian who goes to church every Sunday doesn't know this stuff. I mean, I didn't know a lot of this until 2 weeks ago or something like that. But Paul's readers knew exactly what was going on, and to them it made sense, and I hope for us it will make more sense by the time we're done here. Now, people can say all they want about the cultural issues that were affecting what Paul was writing back then and so forth, and all of that is legitimate. But from the very beginning, when I read this, I wondered, why is this so controversial? Because what I'm reading, it's actually rather obvious here. Paul writes very clearly in verse 12, I do not permit a woman, so on and so forth. He doesn't say God does not permit this. He doesn't say it's a sin to do this. He is clearly saying this is a Paul rule right now. And that's okay. He can do that. He's an apostle. He was set over certain churches to set certain rules and limits. There's nothing, again, that implies an infinite extension of time to prohibit women. On Mother's Day, I really want to clarify how much Paul actually cared about women, and we might not see that in the beginning, but when you get to this point, I think it's pretty clear to see he goes to the trouble to set temporary rules to protect women. I cannot imagine, like I said, when I got started out, being thrown in the pulpit and you have a bad experience, what's going to happen? You're never going to want to do that again. So you can think of it this way, that if it were widely understood back then that women had no role whatsoever in teaching and authority of the church, Paul wouldn't have even had to write what he did. Yet, he was very specific about this temporary prohibition. And if you ask me, whether you're a man or a woman, nowadays our church, not all that different than what it was in the first century. They needed more workers back then. We need a lot more workers right now. Attendance was on the decline in churches even before, the COVID in 2020. And we know that we on a large scale have not completely recovered. Doesn't seem like people are really in a hurry to knock down the doors to get back into the church, sadly enough. There's just no need that I see to restrict church participation even farther, whether it's teaching, preaching, and so forth. To say that the Apostle Paul wanted nothing to do with women in the church would make him the biggest hypocrite out there. Because again, you have to read the Bible in the entirety. Read at least the New Testament in its entirety too. There's many examples where he refers to women helping him in ministry. If they aren't allowed to teach and preach, why is he allowing them to help him? Again, there's a disconnect there. So somebody, when they're reading this, something should go off in your head. I have something wrong here. Either he shouldn't have allowed them, to help, or maybe I have it wrong in his prohibition to ever help out. I recommend this week, read the very last chapter of Romans 16. And this is one, by the time you get through Romans, you get through all the good stuff and the rules and the doctrine and all that. Then he gives a lot of thanks. He always ends his letters, thank this person, greet this person, and so forth. So we might just read, you read through and you sort of skim it fast and you want to move on to the next letter. But actually read it very close and take note all of the women that he mentions in that one chapter. And just a few of them here. He says, I commend to you our sister Phoebe, a deacon of the church. Okay, a deacon, by the way, back then teaching position. So he's already contradicting in our minds what he later writes in Timothy. But we know it's not a contradiction. Greet Mary, who worked very hard for you. Greet Tryphena and Tryphosa, those women who work hard in the Lord. Greet my dear friend Persis, another woman who has worked very hard in the Lord. And you can find some of these other female names at the end, I think, of some of the Corinthian letters. And just look through Paul's letters, the very end, when he gives his greetings, and find out how many women you actually see. That is actually what Paul really meant. Now, some people, they might be on board with this, but then you can sort of swing the pendulum too far the other way, and that's not a good thing either. Some people want to bend over backwards, that we're going to be hip and new and we're going to have a woman preacher and it's going to bring in people and all this. That's not the spirit of what Paul's writing either. Paul worked alongside women because they were willing, not because they were women. Paul was putting someone in the position of leadership just because she's a woman, It's a very good way to cause division, just like we ought not be putting men in positions of leadership just because they're a man either. Paul actually had some very strong words in Romans when he says, I urge you, brothers and sisters, to watch out for those who cause divisions and put obstacles in your way that are contrary to the teaching you have learned. Keep away from them, for such people are not serving our Lord Jesus Christ, but their own appetites. This idea about women in church, hardly ever talked about in church, from my experience anyway. Maybe you've heard some messages about it before. There's a lot more to it, actually, but really the more of it just confirms what I've already showed for you this morning. We need to look at what Paul was trying to accomplish more so than his methods of accomplishing, because the methods are going to change in every cultural setting. He didn't want anyone mimicking the secular culture, for one thing. He didn't want anyone drawing unnecessary attention to themselves either. He didn't want anybody minding everybody else's business too. At that time, the best way to preserve the dignity of the church was to simply restrict the activities of women until they matured. Was every woman in that church or those churches he oversaw to blame? I'm sure not. I'm sure they weren't. But consider, with the personalities that typically come with the kind of things that I described for you, could you imagine how that would go over if Paul would pick and choose or do a case-by-case basis? For instance, well, Susie here can do this, but Ethel can't do that, and Abby can do this, but Hazel's not allowed to do that. You could imagine the divisions that would be created then, and all the fighting that would go on. And Paul he wasn't trying to be anybody's friend, for sure. He had the church at the forefront of his intentions, and he did the most practical thing that he could that would not cause divisions. Despite the confusion of this passage, there's still some very valuable lessons that we can learn. And we don't want to just say, well, the next time I read the Bible, I'm just going to stop at 1 Timothy 2:7, and then I'm going to skip down to chapter 3. No, we can't do that, because there's still some good things in there that we need to learn. What we need to do is understand that we should put the church first. Whether you're a man or a woman, that's an idea behind what Paul's saying. He's also saying social status doesn't matter in the church. He's saying we must be properly prepared to minister, and the church must remain an orderly place in order to worship God and for believers to grow. All of these ideas are mentioned in there. I hope you know more now of what Paul really meant whenever he was writing this than when we started, 20, 30 minutes ago. The church is not in the Dark Ages by any means, as some try to suggest by reading this without the context. The church has actually been cutting edge in these things really since its inception. And the church allows anybody plenty of opportunities to learn and teach and grow, regardless of your age, your race, your gender, your ethnicity, all these kind of things that the enemy likes to use to separate and cause divisions. Biblical Christianity is clear that women have a lot to offer. It's also clear that men have a lot to offer too. I think it's almost silly that I have to say women have a lot to offer. Why am I even making that distinction? Well, we make that distinction because people have misinterpreted in the past. Paul summarizes this well in another letter of his, in his letter to the Galatians, when he says, and again, does this make sense with Romans 16 as well as what we read in 1 Timothy? There is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female. For you are all one in Christ Jesus. If you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. That doesn't sound like a man who just wants women to basically shut up and not teach, as many people misinterpret nowadays. On Mother's Day, I think of my own mother, who taught me a lot growing up about the Bible. And not only was it her right to teach me in the home, but still to teach me, but it was her duty to do so. And I hope every woman here has taken advantages in your lives of opportunities to minister wherever God's placed you. If it's your children in the home, great. Your grandchildren in the home, fine. If it's someone in a place you worked outside the home, then God bless you as well. I don't know where we would be if we didn't have faithful women who were willing to stand up and lead and to follow God's lead in their lives. Christian mothers are not being replaced at the same rate as they are leaving us, as they are going into heaven. Somebody is going to have to rise up when needed, because God is not going to allow his church to flounder in the end days. And the Bible's clear in at least a very broad sense. Yes, we have been in the end days for quite some time. And among those people who rise up, I expect many of them to be women. What's the numbers? Like 2/3 of all people on the planet are women. So it would just make sense that more of them may be called to ministry positions. But before I close, Paul does write, and I just want to tie it up with this. He writes about Eve, who usurped Adam's authority, and that was authority in the home. That is completely different, by the way, than what he was talking about in the church. Paul's concern is that women don't exceed the authority that God gives them, and like Eve did. But think about all the women, though, who followed Eve. God used Esther for a time such as this. He used Deborah as a judge. He used Ruth. He used Rahab. He chose Mary to give birth to the Christ child, which is the tie-in to the very end of 1 Timothy 2, where Paul has this sort of cryptic verse that sort of seems out of place, may not make a lot of sense, about women being saved through childbearing. Doesn't mean you have to give birth in order to be saved. Okay, that's ridiculous. He's talking about the bearing of one special child, and that was Jesus Christ, and given birth by a woman, by the way. Sort of sounds odd to say that, but I'm emphasizing the point there. Jesus Christ, who saves both men and women, it says, if they continue in faith, love, and holiness with propriety. The women here are following a great legacy of faithful believers in the church. And as followers of Jesus Christ, transcending the mere fact that you are women. Along with the men here, you are servants of the Most High God, and that should give us all a sense of purpose in the world that seeks desperately to divide us, and a secular world that really has no clue what Paul really meant. Let's close with a word of prayer.